The only works which will be accepted in the exhibition will be those showing genuine originality and a modern spirit. Copies, imitations, and pastiches of historical styles will be strictly excluded.
Without a revolution of the barricades, without any rifle shots, but by simple evolution, accelerated by the rapid rhythm of the period, we see decorative art in decline. We observe the almost hysterical confusion of these last few years, which have led towards an almost orgiastic decor, as nothing but the last gasp of an already predictable decease.
Built into the program of the 1925 exhibition from the start was the determination to encourage specifically modern design. To some extent, the exhibition did succeed in this aim, and in the main part of this program, I want to look at the results of this effort. In the last section, I want to look at Le Corbusier's contribution to the exhibition and how he challenged the whole concept of the decorative arts which the exhibition stood for. Like the 1900 exhibition, this one was laid out along the Esplanade des Invalides and along both banks of the Seine, though not this time on the Champ de Mars. The Esplanade des Invalides was laid out on an academically symmetrical plan, with limitations on the ground plans and heights of the buildings. Within these constraints, the architects had to try to make each pavilion as individual as possible. Let's have a look at some of them and see what they tell us about the attempt to create a modern style and about the means used to express individuality.
The architecture of the exhibition showed certain definite tendencies which hadn't hitherto been met with in other international exhibitions. Use was no longer made of the recognized elements in architectural design. Effect was sought and obtained by simple massing, by the elimination of molded cornices, bands and plinths, and by the grouping of window and door openings in such a way as to give effect to plain wall surfaces. The problem of the pavilion was one for which there was little or no precedent in historic architecture. The problem, in fact, lent itself especially well to experiments in new forms. Architects have sought a solution in one of two directions. Some have deliberately turned their backs on the past. Others have, as deliberately, aimed at reproducing well-known idioms of some definite historic style. Typical examples of these methods of attack were the Russian pavilion and the Italian pavilion.
Well, of course, this is the Russian pavilion and this is the Italian pavilion here. And as you can see from some of the details, like the capitals and the entablature, the ghost of historicism was not entirely laid, though the Italian pavilion is not really typical of all the pavilions in the exhibition. But then it would be equally unwise to choose the Russian pavilion as typical of the architecture of the national pavilions. Most of them were much less radical. For instance, although the 75-foot-high glass tower of the Polish pavilion looks structurally daring, the rest of the building is really quite mundane. The interior reveals a characteristic common to many of the national pavilions, a continuing penchant for the folkloric as a means of national expression. Vernacular arts and crafts of this kind made up a considerable part of the decorative arts in the international section of this exhibition. The Dutch pavilion by J.F. Staal shows a characteristic mixture of colonial architecture, the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright, and references to the contemporary Amsterdam school with its expressive use of brick and transformed Dutch gable. Inside, there's a sense of continuous space created by the high roof and the continuous narrow band of windows. And there's a big window on the entrance front, suspended from the heavy, overhanging eaves. And in the Danish pavilion, perhaps the most elusive and unidentifiable of all the national pavilions, the non-structural courses of bricks laid in concrete make an immediate visual impact with the minimum of means. And of course, there's no trace of historicist national style in the Russian pavilion. Unlike the 1900 exhibition, the architects of the national pavilions were searching for a new style, new ways of making their pavilions stand out. And by and large, this was the same aim that the architects of the commercial pavilions had on the Esplanade des Invalides, to attract visitors by promoting an image of stunning modernity and extravagance. The emphasis is on sumptuous surface effects. There's a suggestion of gaiety and leisure. There's this astonishing gilded motif in a central window to lure you in. All this glittering packaging whets the appetite for the goodies within. Inside the Galeries Lafayette pavilion, this image is extended with this huge central space with its rather grandiose detailing. The Galeries Lafayette was typical of many department stores in that it hired a designer, Maurice Dufresne, to run a design department called La Maîtrise to try to promote a consistent design image for the store's furnishing lines. Then as now, one of the most effective ways of achieving this aim was to draw attention to the more expensive and exclusive side of the store's range. This is a bedroom designed by Dufresne.
This lady's bedroom is so feminine, so dainty. An harmonious, pale softness, whites shading off into creamy beige. A tasteful arrangement in which no harsh colours intrude. The sumptuous, low bed extends from a silver niche shot with gold.
The appeal here isn't hard to identify. We're familiar with this kind of interior as a setting for Hollywood film stars in the 1920s and 30s. In his dining room, Dufresne sets an apparently more serious tone.
The overall colour scheme is composed of blue, steel grey and silver. There is concealed lighting in the ceiling. The table rests on a monolithic marble plinth, which supports a cage of decorated, polished steel. On top is a slab of plate glass, and in the centre is a long, raised crystal trough running the length of the table. From underneath, hidden lighting illuminates jets of water which sprinkle bunches of cornflowers.
What at first looked like a restrained and elegant piece of design turns out to be full of extravagant conceits.
The man's room is intended for a busy bachelor, a businessman who seeks diversion in masculine pursuits. There is a smoker's table with a pipe rack, a smoker's chair, a sofa in heavily textured, varnished mahogany with a tiger skin cover. And the overall effect is an exciting combination of different textures.
Dufresne gives this room its particular stylistic connotations through his rather self-indulgent expression of the stereotyped needs of the modern man. This room was presented in the Primavera Pavilion as a replica of a room in a villa in the south of France. This sort of thing with its internal swimming pool must have seemed as remote to the man in the street as the rooms by Dufresne we looked at just now. Part of their function, however, was to lend prestige to branches of design which did fall within the range of the middle-class client at least. But in the same pavilion were some rooms, like this studio dining room, displaying quite simple, apparently utilitarian furniture. In contrast to Dufresne's bedroom, which we saw earlier, Sonio in the Primavera bedroom tried to create a modern stylistic effect through abstract patterns in the carpet, in the fur bedspread, in the curtains, and in the wallpaper. The lacquered, stepped, extending table adds to the impression of conscious modernism. The Primavera hall, like the Galeries Lafayette, was so grand and imposing that the sitting room layout seems dwarfed and silly in comparison. The furniture blends well together, despite the fact that it's the work of different designers. The success is due to René Guilleret, the head of the design department, who succeeded in creating a common style for Primavera as Dufresne had in Galerie Lafayette. This gives the store's productions an identity. A feature, in fact, of the 1925 exhibition was the prestigious role the great designers played. Ruhlmann, for instance, had a whole pavilion to himself. He ran a highly successful design studio of his own. He emphasized luxury and the expression of cultivated taste. These interiors were executed for a wealthy connoisseur. Although he was best known for his conscious preservation of traditional French craftsmen's values, his furniture is by no means historicist. This chest of drawers, with its inlaid ivory and highly polished surfaces, is typical of Ruhlmann's stress on craftsmanship. The carpet is quite adventurous with its bold design, but fits well into the whole. And the small chair is a characteristically mannered but elegant derivation from Art Nouveau forms. This sideboard is in amboina, inlaid with ivory interlocking rings. The sculpted handle is cast in silvered bronze. It was exhibited in what was intended to be the showpiece of the French section, a complete layout for a French embassy and ambassador's residence. It encapsulates the central aim of the whole exhibition, to carry modern French design and taste all over the world. This grand salon is by Rapin and Selmersheim, and it seems conventional enough, but other designers exploit a more radically modern vocabulary. This is Dunant's smoking room. The ceiling is stepped back and has recessed lighting. The carpet is bright orange, and the chairs are in shiny black lacquer. This is the most outright example of the kind of design which came to be characterized as jazz modern in the later 20s. It's full of inventive details, like the silver and red abstract decorative panel, reflected in the high gloss lacquered table, the simple chairs with black lacquered frames and silvered panels, and the daybed with its pseudo-primitive decoration incised on the lacquered surface and its decorated cushions inspired by post-cubist art. The ambassade also contained work by 3 architects who were key figures in the Parisian avant-garde of the later 20s. They're Rue Spitz, Charot, and Mallet Stevens. This is Rue Spitz's connoisseur's hall for the embassy. He uses marble panels on the walls and mosaic tiling on the floors to achieve surface interest without confusing the purity of the spaces with ornament. Pierre Charot designed this compact panelled library with its ingenious skylight, with a segmental diaphragm which could be closed at night. Charot produced a genuinely architectural effect here, which went far beyond mere surface decoration. Something of this architectural character comes over in his desk design, in rosewood veneer on mahogany and oak. The effect is of a complex moulded shape composed of interlocking solids. The third architect, Robert Mallet Stevens, offered an example of the most extreme use of unadorned white plaster surfaces articulated by thin black edging. Notice the piercing of the stair wall, and the way in which the highly formalized lights are used to echo the architectural space. The decorative wall panel by Robert Delaunay shows the Eiffel Tower triumphing over academic architecture, represented by the classical temple. It's significant that this and an abstract wall panel by Fernand Léger were removed by the exhibition authorities. You can see that it's no easy task to decide whether the 1925 exhibition promoted modern design or not. We have been able to establish 1 or 2 points quite clearly. Firstly, there was little blatantly historicist design in evidence, though most of the traditional values remained. But if there wasn't much patterning and ornament, there was little plain simplicity. Expert craftsmanship, expensive materials, highly finished surfaces, novel forms and ingenious and luxurious fittings remained the hallmark of most French design, despite the change in language. It was all very new and exciting, but at root still basically reassuring. For example, Paul Follow's music room is based on a transparently classical idiom, though adapted to the stylistic conceits of 1925. These capitals are electric lights. A quite different kind of stylistic silliness was applying cubic forms indiscriminately to furniture, as we see in Madame Klotz's studio hall. She even used a sort of geometrical camouflaging in the stair carpet, which breaks up the shape of the steps. Such formalism was eventually to make 20s design ludicrous. This bedroom for a young girl by Max Bloch exploits semicircular forms to a pointless degree. Rooms like these demonstrate how some designers tried to create an unmistakably new style. If they seem exaggerated to us now, they seemed adventurous then. Some of the most interesting designs in the exhibition were avowedly temporary, like Patou's Nacrolac kiosk behind me. These kiosks by Joe Bourgeois were simpler and show a visual connection with similar projects by Bauhaus designers. Minimal structures in every sense, they were to be brightly colored and were to explore the spatial possibilities of the open rectangle to the maximum. When we come to the kiosks in the Russian section, we find a more concerted rationale. Since the revolution, avant-garde architects had had opportunities for experimenting with temporary kiosks for propaganda and information purposes. This provides us with the context in which the Russian pavilion can best be understood. This is one of only 2 buildings which have survived as pioneering works in the history of architecture which were in the 1925 exhibition. Melnikov understood the main role and function of exhibition architecture, which is to be temporary, to be nothing more than a shop window display. Within the limits of a predetermined ground plan, Melnikov's division of the pavilion into 2 unequal wedges, with this staircase running diagonally through the building and a continuous space inside, is an inventive departure from the more usual symmetrical plans adopted by other architects. Melnikov himself describes it like this.
This glass box wasn't determined by an idea, an abstraction. I took into consideration the site I'd been offered, which was hemmed in by trees. My pavilion had to stand out from their foliage by its color, bright red, its height, and by the play of volumes. My budget was limited, and that restricted my choice of materials. I wanted to give the pavilion the maximum feeling of light and air. Not everyone who passes a shop goes into it, but everyone who passed mine would know what was inside. Its walls are of glass, and the staircase accommodates a large number of people at once, and as it traverses the building, it allows plunging views into the interior of the pavilion. As for the alternating diagonal planes which dominate the building, it's too bad if they upset those who like a roof over their heads. They make as good a roof as any. Their arrangement was designed to throw off water while allowing air to circulate freely.
Although Melnikov denied that his building had any symbolic intention, the red painted wooden frame, the asymmetrical plan, the dynamic tension induced by the diagonal staircase piercing the main structure, and the graphic use of lettering were interpreted by many people as carrying a disruptive ideological message. Partly this was due to political prejudice, but the furore caused by Le Corbusier's Esprit Nouveau pavilion was provoked by his views about architecture, which the pavilion was seen to represent. It employed fanatically simple surfaces and materials. This staircase was bought off the peg from an industrial company, while the doors were metal sheet affairs made for him by the Roneo Sheet Metal Company. From the hall, you looked through to a blinding glare created by a double-height window partly veiled by white curtains. This window, on the right, was itself intended to be industrially manufactured, being in every respect as simple and crude as industrial windows. Next to the sitting room was a covered terrace, which incorporates an existing tree on the site, for which the roof of the terrace has been adapted. The whole thing, complete with its garden, was intended by Corbusier to be simply one cell in an infinitely extendable block of flats. In 1925, Corbusier published L'Art décoratif d'aujourd'hui, which criticized the very principles on which the 1925 exhibition was founded. What was needed, said Corbusier, was not decoration, but a totally new way of looking at the problems which had been created by new social needs and new technologies. Mass housing was the most important need of post-war France, and the Esprit Nouveau pavilion provided a solution. Structurally, it employed a framework of reinforced concrete ribs. You can see them in the wall of the garden terrace. In between the ribs were light infill panels of a composite material. He wanted a structure which could be quickly assembled using engineering techniques such as the cement cannon. Unfortunately, these techniques were not readily available by this time. Instead of a luxurious and costly paneling or decorated wallpaper, Corbusier sought aesthetic release in space, light, and air. The sitting room was raised through the full height of the cell and lit by the great window. Above, the gallery carried the bedrooms and bathrooms. Below was the dining room. In this axonometric view, you can see the whole layout as part of the intended blocks of flats. Notice how tiny the lavatory is here and the bathroom in this space here. Corbusier gets around the problem of lighting simply by running continuous windows along the back, here, and the big windows, which you saw earlier, on the front. You can also see the ribs running through the floor at 5-meter intervals and running down the walls here, and the concrete piers as well. In the bedroom, you can see what he calls the caissier, modular boxes with a variety of fittings which could be combined to form room-dividing storage partitions. Here, an off-the-peg version serves as a partition between the sitting room and the dining room. We really seem to be in a different world from the other interior designs we've been looking at. The light bentwood chairs by Tonnet were among the cheapest you could buy, but very satisfying in this refined atmosphere. The simple, solid leather arm chairs were comfortable but unobtrusive. Everyday objects provide the light relief. Flowers, a globe, a model aeroplane were all that was needed. The 1925 Exhibition of Decorative Arts stood for decor and interior design, and the preservation of the role of the artist-decorator and the skilled craftsman. Instead of the new interior decorator, Le Corbusier looked to the architect, who could solve the problems of housing, and to the industrialist who could mass-produce the necessary equipment. Le Corbusier had no place in his system for decor and the decorative arts. He agreed with Adolphe Loos that the more sophisticated people became, the less need they had of ornaments. Of course, he chose to overlook the function of ornaments in design, which had always been to express in intelligible form the social and economic values of the age. By 1925, designers had exorcised the kind of historicist detail typical of the 1900 exhibition and of the 19th century, but had discovered new ways of expressing traditional values in apparently progressive form. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose.